So this week's lectures will both be asking questions about what kind of country, and by that I mean the nation generally and the states as well, were likely to emerge from breaking away from Great Britain. How would independence from Great Britain affect the ways in which individual states and the states joined in one nation would govern? And this isn't just a question of little political technicalities. As people at the time well knew, aside from the obviously central task of winning the war and gaining independence, it was political change, the creation of new state governments and the creation of some kind of new American government that would most shape the outcome of the revolution as a whole. As Thomas Jefferson said smack in the middle of the revolution, it's always handy when historical characters say exactly what you want them to say. As he said in the middle of the revolution, quote, "In truth, a new government is the whole object of the present controversy, for should a bad government be instituted for us in the future, it had been well to have accepted at first the bad one offered to us from beyond the water without the risk and expense of the contest." So he lays it out right there. Basically, as everyone at the time well knew, it was in the creation of governments, in individual states and one for all of the states, that the revolution would really be lost or won. Now, on a really immediate level, Americans knew that they needed effective state governments to win the war, but in the longer term, they also knew that they needed effective governments to survive and prosper after the war's end, and that's going to be some of what we're talking about today. Now, there was a lot of government making on the state level in this period. When the colonies declared independence in 1776, and they formally threw off the British political system, what had formerly been colonies became states, and as such, they needed to create new state governments that took the place of the royal structure of governance, inventing new ways for individual states to govern themselves. So basically, from 1776 through the 1780s, the individual states, and as we'll see in a bit, the Continental Congress, struggled to determine the best way to establish new governments according to the revolution's prevailing hopes and ideals. Now, this was really a remarkable period of political experimentation. They use that word all the time, and so I love repeating it because it's easy to pass over, but it captures what that felt like to them. That they were experimenting, and in an experiment, you truly don't know the outcome. As Benjamin Franklin said, "We are, I think, in the right road of the spirit of improvement, for we are making experiments." Just spoken like a man of science. Fueled by the optimism of the revolution, this was an age of experiments in government. And many moons ago, 1,000 years ago, I don't remember when it was that I saw on TV, Gordon Wood on a documentary make a comment, but it stuck with me because I thought it was a way of capturing the experimental nature of things in this period. Historian Gordon Wood, a famous historian of the revolution, he said, if you think about nowadays how you feel like you might wake up in the morning and there'll be some new form of technology that enables you to create a new pair of shoes every day or whatever, come up with some insane thing that technology could do, and it would not surprise us to wake up in the morning and have some weird, amazing new technology exist. His point was, that's what politics felt like in the end of the 18th century. It felt like things were happening and people weren't entirely sure what they meant or how they would work or if they would work. Now, these experiments had some commonalities, so there were some themes and some fears and hopes that these governments shared in states and, as we'll see, in the national government as well. So, for example, there was a prevailing fear of a concentration of executive power like the power of the monarch that Americans had just broken away from. That's very logical. So after condemning King George as a tyrant, they were hardly going to lay groundwork for someone new to be able to become a tyrant. So almost every state constitution that was created in this time period increased the power of the lower house of the legislature and decreased the power of the state executive, the governor, and of the upper house of the legislature as well. As we'll see in a moment, the national government created under the Articles of Confederation followed the same general pattern. It lacked any executive or judicial branch. So all told, most new state constitutions in this period of constitution making shared a few basic institutional features: a strong bicameral legislature, a weak executive, they added in rotation in office, and a somewhat broader electorate when it came to voting in annual elections. Along these lines, on July 12, 1776, just after they declared independence, the Second Continental Congress was also attempting to create a proposal for a new national government. And ultimately, their answer to that question became the Articles of Confederation. Between 1776 and 1777, the Congress drafted the Articles of Confederation, a document that pretty much created the United States of America. If you look at the Articles of Confederation and look at the opening, it starts out with "we, the people of the United States of," and then lists all the states. It did that for very practical reasons. If not all the states were willing to join the articles, and they could just be crossed off. So the document creates at least the idea of the United States of America. But it's really important to note that the Articles of Confederation meant this phrase, the United States of America, very literally, because the Articles of Confederation created a League of United States, not one continental nation. As John Adams put it later, "We never thought of consolidating this vast continent under one national government. Instead, we erected a confederacy of states, each of which must have a separate government." So when 13 free and independent states united to defeat England, they were not necessarily thinking of one big unified continental republic. And that's precisely what the Articles of Confederation did not create. It created a loose league of individual republican governments. In a sense, the newly created American Confederation was almost more of a United Nations than a central governing institution. As the articles themselves stated, they were intended to create, quote, "a firm league of friendship." Like, think about that word, right? "We shall create a firm league of friendship for the common defense, the security of our liberties, and our mutual and general welfare." It basically constituted a pact between 13 sovereign states which agreed to delegate certain specific key powers to a central government for specific purposes, but which retained all of their other internal powers as states. So all told, there was really very little centralized power under the Articles of Confederation. So let's look for just a moment at what kind of a government the Articles of Confederation created. For one thing, under the Articles, the national government consisted of a one-chamber national Congress elected by state legislatures. And in that Congress, in that national Congress, each state had one vote. Very straightforward. That one-chamber Congress, the Confederation Congress, had basically no power of enforcement. We're going to see how that plays out in just a couple minutes. It could request funds from the states, but could enact no tax of its own without every state's approval. Good luck with that. The Articles also, as I mentioned a moment ago, did not create an executive branch. Rather, congressional committees oversaw financial, diplomatic, and military affairs, nor was there a judicial system by which the national government could compel allegiance to its laws. So basically, as far as its powers were concerned, the Confederation Congress was designed to fill the place of the imperial system. It could regulate foreign affairs, it could declare war with foreign countries or negotiate peace treaties, it could fix standards for weight and measurements, it could manage Indian affairs, and it could borrow money, but it could not tax. So basically, the Confederation Congress had power over war and foreign affairs. And the states, for the most part, retained control over their own internal affairs. Now, given what I've just described, it's really, really tempting to dismiss this new government under the Articles as hopeless, right? We know what comes next. We know the Constitution's down the road. I've just described all the ways in which this Congress is weak and can't really enforce anything. But it's important to realize that in the context of the time, the Articles of Confederation made perfect sense given the experience of the Revolution, because they basically denied the new national government the very powers and violations that they saw at the heart of the Revolution. So, for example, the Confederation Congress couldn't tax. It couldn't overrule local law. It couldn't alter state constitutions. It couldn't interfere with state judicial proceedings. During the Revolution, all of these things happened in one way or another at the hands of the British government. And to avoid an entrenched elite, the Articles, as I mentioned a moment ago, established rotation in office. So you couldn't remain in office more than 3 of every 6 years. You couldn't be president of Congress more than 1 in every 3 years. And every delegate in the Congress was subject to instant recall from their home state. So basically, under the Articles of Confederation, there were a lot of restrictions on the power of the national government. And there were relatively few restrictions on the states themselves, though there were a few. They're very basic, but there were a few. So, for example, no state could enter into alliances or treaties with foreign nations on their own. They needed the consent of Congress. No 2 or more states could enter into a confederation of their own without the consent of Congress. States were not to keep warships or troops in peacetime unless Congress deemed it necessary for defense. States could not declare war without consent of Congress, except in the case of sudden invasion. So there's even an except there. So obviously, none of these restraints are placing too serious a check on the sovereignty of the individual states. So essentially, the Articles of Confederation were designed so the new nation's central government would not infringe on the states. You can really see how the Articles centered on defining and limiting the amount of power given to the Confederation Congress. Well, today we're going to look at the impact of that decision, basically at how the Articles played out in the 1780s, given the amount of power that they did, and as we'll see, didn't have. It would be hard to exaggerate the degree to which many people really fundamentally did not trust centralized political power in this time period, in governments, in executive power, in anything. Even the people on the committee appointed to draft the Articles of Confederation were not entirely at ease with the idea of creating some kind of centralizing power. Listen to what Edward Rutledge of South Carolina wrote to a friend, and he is on the committee that's creating the Articles of Confederation. So he wrote to a friend in the middle of it, and he says, "If the plan now proposed should be adopted, nothing less than ruin to some colonies will be the consequence. The idea of destroying all provincial distinctions," which really is not what the Articles say, but again, very sensitive to this idea that there's something big that's going to be over the states. "The idea of destroying all provincial distinctions and making everything of the most minute kind bend to what they call the good of the whole is, in other terms, to say that these colonies must be subject to the government of the eastern, meaning northern, provinces. The force of their arms I hold exceeding cheap, but I dread their overriding influence in council. I dread their low cunning. And of course, he's talking about us, I should say. He's talking about New Englanders, just in case you haven't caught that. I dread their low cunning and those leveling principles which men without character and without fortune, us, in general possess, which are so captivating to the lower class of mankind and which will occasion such a fluctuation of property as to introduce the greatest disorder. I am resolved to vest the Congress with no more power than is absolutely necessary, for I am confident, if surrendered into the hands of others, a most pernicious use will be made of it. Now listen to some of what Rutledge just said there. He's afraid that making everything bend to the good of the whole will be the same thing as subjecting all of the colonies and now all of the states to the eastern provinces, New England. He says, oh, if we give up some power, those New Englanders, those crafty New Englanders, they're going to take over everything. And then he goes on and says, the force of their arms I hold exceeding cheap, right? So they can't really fight. They're not really a threat. Like, I'm not worried about that. But I dread their overruling influence in council. So what's scary to him is that New Englanders are somehow going to take over the government. So how is that for a spirit of unity and a league of friendship from someone who is actually drafting the articles? You know, when I was in grad school and I began studying the 1790s, which we come to next week, somehow I imagined that there was going to be some little golden period like 1789 and 90, the very beginning of the government, that there would be this moment when people from all different regions and states would say, let's give it a go. Like, we're in this together. We trust each other. Yay. No. Never. From the very beginning, you had people saying, I don't trust those people from that other part of the Union. There was someone who wrote a letter to James Madison in, I want to say 1789 or 90, so the government has just started, and said, along the lines of Edward Rutledge, what we have to do now is make sure that all the clerks in this new government are Southern men, because then they will grow into the positions and we won't have to be governed by Yankees. The government hasn't even got off the ground, and they're thinking that way. Okay, so you can get a sense of how uneasy people were with centralizing power or giving away power in any way, particularly given fears about giving up some of the power and sovereignty held by their own independent states. In fact, fears about the powers of individual states, logically enough, came up throughout debate over the Articles. How should individual states be represented in the Confederation Congress? Should little states have the same amount of power as big states? Shouldn't big states have more power in this new union? As James Wilson of Pennsylvania put it, it is strange that annexing the name of state to 10,000 men should give them an equal right with 40,000. That must be the effect of magic, not reason. So, not surprisingly, the next time that a new kind of centralized government is discussed, the Constitution, that issue for sure is going to come up again. Another question about the power of individual states that came up during debate over the Articles concerned Western lands. Not surprisingly, there was a big division between large landed states that had extensive Western claims, so states like Massachusetts and New York and Virginia and North Carolina, and small landless states like Maryland and New Jersey and Delaware. Landless states wanted the Confederation Congress to take over the individual states' Western territorial claims and convert them into a common stock of land whose sale could provide a painless way of helping pay off Revolutionary War debt for all of the states. So the idea behind this was, okay, we all fought a war, we should all be paying for it together. Obviously, the states that owned Western lands did not feel the same way. They wanted to keep those lands. They wanted the value of those lands. So thanks to these kinds of issues about centralized power, the Articles were debated from mid-1776 through November of 1777, when they were finally completed and submitted to the states for ratification. And the main reason why debate stopped in 1777 was not because those questions had been settled, but because of the American victory at Saratoga. Basically, people realized that if the states weren't united into some kind of political entity at that point, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for them to get aid from France. So signing the Articles of Confederation and sending them off for ratification was a way of giving added credence to the American cause in the eyes of the world at a really strategic moment. As Samuel Chase of Maryland wrote in the middle of the debate over the Articles, "What contract will a foreign state make with us when we cannot agree among ourselves?" So that basic reality led Congress to finally complete the Articles, November 1777. They submitted it to the states for ratification, and the Articles were ultimately debated in the states, ratified, and put into effect in 1781. Now let's turn to an important thing to consider, which is what happened once the Articles went into effect. And as we set out in this discussion, I feel the need to defend the Articles just a little bit, as I hinted at a few minutes ago. Because as you'll see by the end of today's lectures, in some ways the Articles seem so obviously inadequate that it's easy to look at them and judge them to have been one big mistake. And certainly the grumbling of early nationalists who wanted a much stronger government doesn't help at all the PR for the Articles of Confederation. Throughout the 1780s, and particularly towards the end of the 1780s, people who felt strongly that there needed to be a stronger centralized government were very vocal in expressing their doubts. Nor does the terrible PR for the Articles provided by the Federalist essays help, and I'm going to talk about those on Thursday. As we'll see in part in this week's readings, the Federalist essays were written with an agenda. People always assume that there's some objective analysis of the Constitution, but they weren't. I always say they were a commercial advertisement for the Constitution. They were trying to sell people on this new government. They were aimed at proving that the proposed Constitution was absolutely necessary, and one of the ways in which they did that was to attack the Articles of Confederation. So they did an incredible axe job on the Articles, attacking them for each and every flaw, so that the Constitution would really seem to be a desperately needed logical alternative. So in essence, the Federalist essays didn't do any favors to the continuing reputation of the Articles of Confederation. I will say now, because it's in my brain, I'll come back to it on Thursday, they're not actually called the Federalist Papers. That's what everyone calls them, the Federalist Papers. They were essays under the title The Federalist. Somehow they got that name. I'll show you in the slide that I'm going to put up on Thursday, I'll show you what they looked like when they first came out. Okay, so there are a number of reasons for the Articles to look like one big mistake, but the problem with this idea, as I've mentioned before, is the problem of presentism, of judging the Articles on the basis of what we know comes next, the Constitution. We see the end of the story, we see a federal government, we see a strong national government, and with that knowledge, the weaker Articles of Confederation seem to be little more than a mistake. Judging the past in this way isn't quite fair, because in a sense, it blames people at the time, in the moment, for not knowing what comes next. So rather than condemning the Articles as a mistake, as an oops moment or kind of training wheels form of government, we should instead understand them in the context of the time, studying how they represent a really logical first attempt at a national government based on the fears and assumptions that prevailed in America at the time. As I detail the problems under the Articles of Confederation today, try to bear that point in mind, that yes, they definitely did not function as well as people hoped they would, but that they weren't a stupid mistake, they were a logical first step. Okay, now having just said that, it did not take very long under the Articles for at least some people to become very unhappy with them. And as you're about to see, the 1780s made a lot of people very, very unhappy with the government. Some people were primed to be unhappy, particularly those who had experienced firsthand the problems of the Continental Congress during the war. Some of these people had been at Commander-in-Chief George Washington's headquarters during the war and had experienced firsthand how Congress had no way to demand money or supplies or men from the states, and how basically there was just a frustrating lack of centralized control. Washington and Alexander Hamilton, two very loud criticals of the Articles from a very early point, amidst a number of others who were at headquarters, they all came out of the war experience saying, Congress was useless. We need something stronger. In a way, Washington's headquarters during the war was a kind of stronger central government creating machine. It's not an accident that, as we'll see next week, the Federalist Party, the folks who wanted a stronger central government, so many of them were linked to headquarters. They came out of the war and thought, well, that didn't work. We need something stronger. Other people who distrusted the Confederation Congress tried to deal with foreign affairs during the Revolution and saw how Congress had dilly-dallied and failed to give effective, concrete instructions. Others who distrusted the Confederation Congress had been actual members of Congress and had found themselves really frustrated at some point. So these men perceived what seemed to them like a supreme irony, that it would be the ideals and principles of the revolution that would tear apart the new nation that the revolution had created. The concerns about state sovereignty and about national power might actually destroy the entire experiment in government almost before it began. Okay, so what was so upsetting in the 1780s that got people even more riled up? Let's turn to a couple of events to see. So, for one thing, the state of foreign relations in the 1780s seemed extremely alarming to many people, particularly regarding Great Britain. Despite the fact that by 1781, Americans had won the war, they'd negotiated a treaty, 1781, Britain was still putting up barriers and hurdles. Throughout the 1780s, they simply refused to cooperate with the Treaty of Paris. So, for example, although they had agreed to do so, they refused to abandon their forts in Western territories. They also restricted American trade. They did things like ban the export of machine tools to the United States so that Americans would have great difficulties creating their own manufacturing facilities and, surprise, would have to keep importing manufactured goods from England. You can hear the impact of these developments in a letter that George Washington wrote to a friend as early as 1784. And Washington is not the most fluid writer. He actually really needed Hamilton. Washington said, "The disinclination of the individual states to yield competent powers to Congress for the federal government, their unreasonable jealousy of that body and of one another, and the disposition which seems to pervade each of being all-wise and all-powerful within himself." He's not really good at sentences, George Washington. "Will, if there is not a change in the system, be our downfall as a nation. This is as clear to me as the ABC. It's just not going to work." Domestically, things seemed equally alarming. The Confederation Congress could not even manage to consistently summon a quorum of states so that they could conduct business. Typical of many complaining letters of the period is one by Rufus King of New York, written in 1785. And he wrote, "We have only 5 states represented. Pennsylvania and Connecticut are expected. When they're here, we can form a house." You can hear the sigh in that letter. Why were there so few delegates even bothering to attend Congress? Well, for one thing, they were more interested in concerns in their own states, and so they often just stayed home. In their home states, they were big fish in a smaller pond who could really affect change in their home state. The Confederation Congress didn't have much power, and it didn't give them much power either. So for some of them, centralized issues that affected other states really seemed to be of secondary importance to concerns in their own states. A great example of what I'm talking about here, with people being a lot more concerned with their own state than with sometimes really dramatic things happening in other states, happened as early as 1770, continued through the 1780s. Basically, for a long period of time, New York and New Hampshire both claimed possession of the territory that would eventually become Vermont. They just both said it was theirs. Now, actually, how many do we have Vermont people? No Vermont people? Okay, thank you very much. I always ask, but an amazing lack of Vermont people. At any rate, I'm sorry if I do an injustice to your state. So in 1777, residents of that territory, led by Ethan Allen, declared their independence from New York and New Hampshire, and declared themselves the Republic of Vermont, and they wrote their own constitution. You can totally see the influence of the Revolution there, right? They're like, okay, this is great. We're a republic. We wrote a constitution. Here we go. Now, naturally enough, the governor of New York became extremely concerned about this because part of his state seemingly had just seceded. So he pleaded with New York's delegates to the Confederation Congress to do something. Like just say that the territory belongs to New York and get the other states to agree. New York's governor, as well as any number of other people, got even more concerned when they heard that Ethan Allen was supposedly negotiating with the British to abandon Vermont's claims to independence from Great Britain if the British would recognize their separate status. So we're talking early, this is 1777, and Vermont is saying, maybe we could have some interesting dealings with the British and we actually can do something separate from everybody else if you will recognize our independence as a republic. Accept us as a republic and we will not fight for independence. So that's somewhat alarming to be happening during a revolution, and it represents the dismemberment potentially of two states, New Hampshire and New York. So what did the Confederation Congress do? Nothing. As a delegate from Maryland wrote home to his state governor, he had been called back to Congress because of the supposed crisis of Vermont, but, quote, we have business enough on our hands without carving out more at this time. So he's basically like, come on, we got enough to do. What is this thing? Vermont, New York, New Hampshire? We don't want to deal with it. Ominously, negotiations between Vermont and the British commander stationed at Quebec led to something of a cessation of hostilities there, and Vermont, seeing a total lack of action, became more aggressive. They began to annex to their republic some towns in New Hampshire. There was even some skirmishing with New York on a border in 1781. Well, at this point, Congress panicked, and they made a counter deal with Vermont, offering them statehood, and Vermont held back from talking with the British, and then the Congress failed to follow through. They did nothing more. With Yorktown and the seeming end of the war, that same year, 1781, the British lost interest in Vermont, and thus Congress did as well. So Vermont existed in a kind of limbo. What was it? Was it a republic, part of New York, part of New Hampshire? And the problem of Vermont continued throughout the 1780s. A similar problem arose when part of North Carolina tried to secede from the state of North Carolina. Okay, now I gotta ask again. North Carolina. Oh, there, Toby, I even know your name. Others? Okay, couple, okay. So North Carolina, part of North Carolina decided to secede, again, the revolutionary spirit, and declared itself the state of Franklin. So basically in 1784, when people living in this western part of North Carolina learned that North Carolina might give its western lands to Congress as a way to pay back war debts, they figured, well, we're not actually really part of North Carolina now anyway, are we? So they petitioned Congress to be accepted as the independent state of Franklin. And they began drafting their own constitution. See, these people are big on drafting their own constitutions. Some western territories of Virginia discussed joining the state of Franklin. And there was some discussion of the Cherokee being accepted into the state of Franklin. The problem is that North Carolina ultimately took back its idea of ceding western lands in a flurry of controversy about western lands, and this left the people of Franklin in limbo. They petitioned to Congress to grant them statehood, but ultimately Congress didn't really act, and in the end, North Carolina dealt with its own problem. Okay, so faced with the seeming dismemberment of states and discussion of a state maybe aligning itself with the British during the war, the Confederation Congress really basically managed to do nothing. With no central control of finance and no effective way for the government to overcome state rivalries, interstate commerce, anything like that, all of that also became a big problem in the 1780s. There were over a dozen separate systems of custom regulations at the time, complicating any matters of trade. Okay, and again, think back to the Revolution. What's one of the things they're upset about? Control of trade, control of shipping, customs duties. This is not something that the Articles are going to be really doing. It's something that the states are going to want to retain that power. So to many, allowing Congress to have power over trade was an attack on the sovereignty of the states. And as we'll see on Thursday, ultimately it's a dispute about trade between states that opens the path that ultimately leads to the Constitutional Convention. It's about commerce between states. That's how we end up with a Constitution. Okay, so we've seen a lot of problems. We've seen no ability by Congress to raise money, no power to enforce its decisions in the states, its secondary status among most people, even politicians, to their home governments, and its inability, therefore, for all of those reasons, to confront major problems that were facing the new nation, like Revolutionary War debts, interstate commerce, boundary disputes, parts of states seceding. These are big problems. Many of these limitations came into play in what was essentially a low point for the Confederation Congress that took place in September of 1786, Shays' Rebellion, a controversy that ended up being a wonderfully useful PR tool for extreme nationalists pushing to reform the Articles and strengthen the government. So in September of 1786, farmers in Hampshire County, Massachusetts, began to protest about the fact that their property was being seized because they were unable to pay off their debts and were unable to pay state taxes. And at first, many of these farmers protested in a traditional way, and we've seen some of this already last week. They wrote petitions, and then they staged some ritualistic demonstrations. When these did not work, however, the farmers began to murmur that their petitions were not being respected by their state government. Now, think about that for a moment. Here you see people saying, you know what, we're doing what we should do, we're petitioning, and our words, our protest is not being listened to. It wasn't all that long ago that people were saying that about Parliament and King George. So feeling that they were being repressed and disrespected, their liberties and property under attack, their political voice and will ignored, these Massachusetts farmers began to take more drastic action. Now, a large portion of these protesters were led by a Revolutionary War officer named Daniel Shays, who ultimately was followed by about 1,100 debt-ridden farmers. Shays and his followers criticized their creditors, and actually all merchants in general, as a rising aristocracy bent on depriving them of their liberties. You can totally hear part of the legacy of the Revolution in everything that's unfolding here. Marching on the courts of Massachusetts, Shays and his followers closed the courts and demanded that the state legislature respond to their demands. In response to Shays, the Confederation Congress called out 800 Massachusetts militiamen to suppress this revolt, only to find that the militia refused to act because they sympathized with the farmers. This is a problem. Okay, so here we see a local militia disregarding a request for national defense from the national government. Congress next responded by requesting roughly $500,000 from the states to raise a special force of 1,300 men to crush the rebellion. And basically, they got no response. They could not even raise money to suppress an internal rebellion. So New England is up in arms. The Confederation Congress seemingly can do nothing. So a number of the established elite in Massachusetts, lawyers and merchants, were forced to come up with their own solution. So basically, many of the wealthiest merchants and lawyers in Massachusetts raised their own money to fund a private army. And they eventually assembled a force of several thousand men and suppressed the rebellion. Now, the slide I have here, and I will read it because I realize you can't see what it is. Ezra Stiles, who was president of Yale at the time, was very interested in what was happening in Shays' rebellion. When you look at his diary, he's following what's happening. He actually drew a map of what was happening, like where the rebels were, that I think is in Beinecke Library now. And he wrote this letter to George Washington in February of 1787. And the reason I mention it is because I'll read you the lines that are of interest. He says, "One of my pupils," so a Yale student, "a young gentleman of solidity and good information, was taken into custody by Shays' party and was with him at Petersham." So basically, a Yale student is grabbed by Shays and his followers. And here, Stiles reports, "My student tells me he judges that Shays' corps, when overtaken at Petersham, did not exceed 2,500 at most, and probably was much less. Thus have they fled hitherto before the army. The body of the people, friends to the insurgents, but not in arms, are rather still and astonished, and it is probable their camp has received an unrecoverable shock. They did not expect a spirited resistance." What's fascinating about that to me, first off, is just it plants us right here sitting in New Haven at Yale in the middle of all of this. Stiles is interested in everything that's going on about the revolution in this period, and his diary, which is largely online, really interesting. At any rate, we have all of this going on at this period, and what happens, of course, when the rebellious farmers feel that a hostile army is descending on them to steal their liberties? Stiles says, well, they're shocked. But in fact, no, they did not collapse. They became more rebellious and began staging guerrilla raids against prominent merchants, lawyers, and office holders to overthrow what they saw as the oppressive government of the state. And ultimately, there were 3 little battles between the private Massachusetts Army and Massachusetts farmers, killing or wounding about 50 farmers and a few dozen of the Massachusetts armed forces. And the warfare ended in 1787 when an economic upturn made some of the farmers' debts easier to pay, and many of the farmers began to see that surrounding states did not seem particularly friendly to what was going on. So a lot of these farmers fled to unsettled northern and western lands after this collapsed. And Daniel Shays fled to, you can probably guess it, the independent Republic of Vermont. But that whole event shook many people. It was particularly upsetting to anyone with doubts about the powers of the government under the Articles of Confederation. The rebellion threw a harsh spotlight on the Confederation Congress and on how defenseless it was to maintain order. And that wasn't the only such uprising, or even potential uprising, that broke out in this period. And I'm going to mention very briefly 2 potential military uprisings that took place as the Continental Army disbanded. One of them, known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, it takes place in Newburgh, New York, consisted of a group of disgruntled Army officers who were tired of waiting for Congress to grant them their pensions, so they formed a plan to refuse to disband in 1783 as an armed force unless they were granted their pensions. So essentially, you're seeing something along the lines of a threat of a revolutionary coup. Army officers who say, you know what, we're sticking around. We'd like to be paid. Ultimately, what quashed the Newburgh conspiracy was George Washington's personal presence. He himself went to Newburgh, New York, to personally plead with the officers to disband. And it's an anecdote I'm going to offer you here, but it's a true anecdote. I love them best of all. So he stands up in front of these officers. He's going to plead with them, please don't do this. And in the middle of his address, he reached for his glasses so he could read his notes. And as he put his glasses on, he said, "I am sorry, gentlemen, but I have grown not only gray but blind in the service of my country." And the officers began to cry. There's a lot of crying in this period among legislatures, officers. The power of the glasses of George, right? That was it. Only slightly less alarming was a revolt in 1783 of some Pennsylvanian soldiers. Congress disbanded them in 1783, sent them home, again, without any payment. Hearing that they had been dismissed from the army without anything being done about their pay, a few hundred soldiers marched to Philadelphia and barricaded some members of the Confederation Congress in the State House, sticking their bayonets through the windows and screaming insults. Yet another threat of a coup. But everything dissolved when some congressmen simply walked out of the building and left without any harm being done to them. So it was a threat with the bayonets, but ultimately the threats weren't acted on. Even so, Congress temporarily moved to Princeton, New Jersey, yet another serious threat to civil authority, yet more evidence that the Confederation Congress didn't seem to have enough power. It's also worth mentioning that these were the kinds of events that strongly reinforced the prevailing distrust of standing armies. As Hamilton would later write in Federalist 21, who can determine what might have been the issue of Massachusetts convulsions if the miscontents had been headed by a Caesar or Cromwell? Who can predict what effect a despotism established in Massachusetts would have upon the liberties of New Hampshire or Rhode Island or Connecticut or New York? The problem to Hamilton and other strong nationalists was that Americans seemed to be so focused on the interests of their states, their homes, that they had seemingly forgotten how to think about themselves as Americans, as a united people. The war had brought the colonies and then the states, Americans, together at a moment of crisis. When that crisis lapsed, Americans basically turned back and went home, and a lot of that spirit of unity went with them. Would it be possible if somehow the states could agree that it was necessary to strengthen their central government to devise some kind of government that would actually be acceptable to all 13 states? Were there enough common bonds to make that possible? Could Americans only be defined when pitted against common enemies? Was there no American identity in and of itself? Those are some of the questions at the heart of this lecture, and those are some of the questions that Thursday's lecture and next week's lectures are going to pick up on. So thank you very much.